Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down. Oh, glory, praise the Lord.
Welcome to the Harvester Podcast, Season 2, Episode 12. Normally, Forrest Antemaceris of the Orange Street Church of Christ in Auburndale, Florida, and Stephen Ford with the South Florida Avenue Church of Christ in Lakeland, Florida, are accompanying me. But this is a very busy time of year, and so they are not available at this time, but we've got to keep up with the schedule. And so for this episode, we are going to introduce critical race theory, also known as CRT for short. And this is something that is definitely a cultural issue in our time, in our day and time, and so we want to address that as we have been addressing these cultural issues. Now, a couple things up front. I want to point out that there is only one race, a human race, and every human is made in the image and likeness of God according to Genesis 1:26 and 27. And so no matter a person's skin color, ethnicity, what side of the tracks he or she came from, every single one of us, male or female, every single one of us is an image bearer of God. And for that reason, we are of intrinsic value, and for that reason it's wrong to kill one another. Genesis 9 verse 6 is the first instance of capital punishment. And in fact, James even said that it's not right to cuss at one and to curse one, a human being, because he is made in the image and likeness of God. And so I will be using race, the word race, quite a bit, simply because that's what the literature about critical race theory uses that term. But I just want you to know that I'll try to use a different term where I can, but especially when I'm quoting them, just know that I realize there's only one human race. And so really any attack against another human would be racism. But usually the way it's used in the world, it's one ethnicity or one skin color against another skin color. And so that's something to be aware of. Also, I want to point out that in this study, there'll be a lot of, especially in some of the quotes and stuff, that will talk about the white world. It'll talk about some things that may be offensive to some people, the terms. But again, the terms are not wrong of themselves. It's just the way they are identified. And since critical race theory began in the late 60s, early 70s, I mean, that's really when it came out. I suppose you could say the roots of it maybe go further back. But most of the proponents of critical race theory are still alive today. They're still lecturing, and they're still on YouTube and everything. And so it's not like we're making this stuff up, but you can listen to them yourselves and find out what the kind of things that they teach. And so it's all available there. But basically, critical race theory comes out of a movement that kind of resisted, that kind of thought the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s was not really on target, that it was going to make matters worse than what it was, what they wanted. And there were two basic things about the civil rights movement that usually when we think of that movement, we think of men like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. But there are two things that they did not like about that. Number one, they did not like the idea of, quote, color blindness, end quote. That is, color blindness, in their eyes, was an attempt to take a person's ethnicity out of the process. Now, when we think of color blindness, and I do want to say here also, I had a discussion with a well-known preacher 12 years ago, and the reason why I know it's 12 years ago is because I first got on Facebook 12 years ago for one reason, and that was to keep up with my grandkids. And my oldest grandchild is 12 years old, and so that's why I know it's 12 years ago about that I got on Facebook. Well, at that time, I didn't know you weren't supposed to, question people, what they said on Facebook. And so a brother wrote something that, I thought was kind of, not right. And he brought up a lot of terms like color blindness, and he brought up a bunch of terms that, 12 years later, I guess about 10 years later, I discovered were really part of this critical race theory. Like where would you hear some of these terms if you had not been exposed to or studying critical race theory? And he was speaking of those terms in favor of them, trying to promote them. And of course, I didn't realize it till 10 years after I had talked to him where these terms came from. And I look back on that, I'm thinking, wow, that brother was influenced by this critical race theory. And no wonder some of the stuff he said was kind of off when compared to the Bible and what the Bible teaches. And so that's kind of behind that. But color blindness was one thing he was using. And so when we think of color blindness, we think of, or at least I do when I first heard that term, it's like color blindness is good because I'm seeing somebody not because of who their ethnicity is. I'm seeing them as a human being equal with me. And so, because of that, the law should apply equally to him as well as me, regardless of our skin color or our ethnicity. There should be no preferential treatment based on skin color. That's what I mean by color blindness. But in critical race theory, the meaning of color blindness, they say, would be a good idea. But since America, they would say, and this is kind of an assumption based upon the past, that since America is too racially biased for color blindness to work, it is simply a facade keeping Americans from really dealing with the problems of race. And of course, there's race again, but ethnicity. In other words, they are saying color blindness is just, well, I almost said whitewashing, but I don't want to, no pun intended there, but it's almost like whitewashing the differences, just covering over the differences of different ethnicities. And of course, there is value in different cultures. Been on several foreign mission work, and I've always appreciated some of the culture that I've found, although some culture is downright unscriptural, but that's why the gospel is needed. But they did not like the idea of color blindness, that is, making all ethnicities as if they're equal. Secondly, critical race theorists did not like, from the civil rights movement, they did not like the idea of integration, where people of all races come together to share values, political power, etc. Integration, they would say, causes people to downplay their racial differences in favor of seeing a common humanity. And in other words, I guess it's the same kind of thing with the color blindness. They want to keep all the different ethnicities, and they saw that integration would kind of ruin that. They would say that the dominant group is true. Well, there's, and the thing about this is there is some truth to this. And so when you think about, like back in the 1800s before the Civil War, where slavery was a real big issue, and it was in North and South in the United States, and it was just a terrible thing that went on for so long. But sometimes critical race theorists will see the present as if it were still the past. And although we've got a long way to go when it comes to ethnic relationships and things like that, we've come a long way since where we were. Even in my lifetime, I've seen that. We have come a long way. But it is true that sometimes the dominant majority group, in this case the Caucasian whites of the United States way back in those days, were the majority group. And to a certain extent, they did destroy the values and culture of the minority group. Although when it comes religiously, well, I don't know. I just knew a brother in Christ. He's deceased now, but he wrote a master's thesis 25 years ago on, the pastoral oversight, why it's so common in some of the what we would call predominantly African-American churches. And his basic conclusion was, and he gave me a copy of it, this was long before electronic versions of the thing could be had, so it was a big old chunk of paper. But anyway, his conclusion was basically that when the slaves came over, a lot of the owners would allow them to have their own church services in a building, even though they might call it the Methodist Church, they might call it this, they might call it that. They were separated from the Caucasians or the whites, and then they would do their own religion, even though a name was on the outside. But when they practiced their religion, and by the way, the one that wrote this thesis was of African descent, that when they practiced their religion, they practice it, kind of like they did in the tribes back in Africa, where you had the chief, and so the chief became the authority, and so as the Civil War went on, and the Emancipation Proclamation, and then as the former slaves started going out into the states and such, they carried that with them. And then even today in churches, according to his thesis, you have that as a major problem in some of in many of the, at least in my area, I've seen this, predominantly black churches, and that is where the preacher's in charge of everything. And the elders and deacons are just treated as kind of like his council. And I've been to Africa 9 or 10 times since 2005, and I've seen how these tribal things work with the chief and all of that. And it's a great eye-opening experience. Those of you who have heard me talk about this, you know that I've said in the past that when I went to Africa for the first time, I saw what I think is the closest to Bible culture that I've ever seen in this world. The way the families are set up, the way the marriages take place, the way the chiefs and all that stuff work. That is the closest thing to what I understand the Bible culture to be like on this earth. But that's a whole other lesson we could look at. But another thing, and so those two things are what really caused critical race theory to pick up, is that they're against those two tenets of the civil rights movement, the idea of color blindness and the idea of integration. And you can see some of this stuff with Malcolm X. Malcolm X was kind of like the antithesis of, well, I don't know if that antithesis is the right word, but he did not believe the same thing that Martin Luther King Jr. did about civil rights and all that kind of thing. Malcolm X, kind of went against, opposed some of the things Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. And the weekend, I guess the week that Robert R. Taylor Jr. passed away, my wife and I were at the Memphis School of Preaching lectureship, and I believe their lectureship ended. Well, we had some time to kill. There was no more lectureship. The lectureship was over, but the funeral was not until, I guess maybe their lectureship ended the day before the funeral, and we had the hotel room that night, and the funeral was in the afternoon. We were going to leave that morning, but we stayed around for the funeral. And we had about some time to kill, so we ended up going to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and I would recommend anybody to go there to visit. And really interesting. But they had a little display in there about Malcolm X and how he did oppose and he went against kind of some of the things Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to do. But that's another situation. But anyway, this race consciousness was something that was very, very prominent with Malcolm X. All right, but critical race theory, basically, one of their tenets also is deconstruction and reconstruction. And what they mean by that, and this is kind of a Marxist take on things. Marxism is behind this, as well as a lot of these isms like communism, socialism, a lot of these isms. But anyway, Marxism, viewed the status quo as the oppressor. The status quo as the oppressor. And then the common folk, and what Marx meant by the status quo was the rich and wealthy who could own land. And the common people could not own land. And so Marxism set it up with the idea that everyone's either an oppressor or the oppressed. And as that applies to critical race theory, the status quo of the American system, the Constitution and all that, because of the slavery and all that was allowed to go on, that is the oppressor. And so then the common folk, or in this case, those with dark skin, those who were brought over as slaves, they're the oppressed. And that was certainly true during slavery, no doubt about it. But they would say that system, the American system with its Constitution and stuff, since it's still there today, that same system that brought about all that slavery, or allowed all that slavery, of course they would say brought it about, is still there, so that is the oppressor. That's the status quo. And so we've got to totally remove all of that from the status quo. And so by doing that, there must be a deconstruction. That is, you take the status quo, you go through that line by line, everything that is against, well, we're going to say racist to use their terms, but everything that is prejudicial, that is biased, that is oppressive, you've got to get rid of that. And you get rid of that, you don't clean it up, you get rid of it totally and put something else in its place. And that sounds good on the surface, but not really how it's applied. It's not good, because instead of cleaning it up, like say, for example, land ownership, let's say mortgages or whatever, and, if only the wealthy could buy land, not because they didn't have the money, but, well, let me see. Let me see if I can put this better. I'm trying to think of something else. Something just crossed my mind, but it left me in here to illustrate this. But, if say the tax law. So the tax law. Well, that's pretty intricate too. Well, let's say a store owner. Let's say back in the day when people could just buy a handshake, make a deal. So if a store owner would only shake hands with the white people to make a deal, and he would not shake hands with the black person, they would say get rid of the handshake. But the better thing to do is keep the handshake, but make it include all different skin colors. And so that would be, you wouldn't have to deconstruct the handshake, but just make sure that it includes everybody. And so you would clean it up instead of do away with it. But that's not what they do. They take the deconstruction, tear it out of there, then put it with something else. Now, the best example that was given, and this was given in a source I had, Ryan Chapman, he gave this example. He's not a member of the church or anything like that, but he gave a pretty good example of this. He said, consider academia, what has happened to academia. And so a prime example of this deconstruction, reconstruction is the process in academia. And so critical race theorists analyzed academia and saw three values that are part of the status quo in academia. Those three values are objectivity, being neutral, and being balanced. And so critical race theorists said that these values are from the, quote, white world, end quote. And so just think about that. So you can't be objective, because they would say that's racist, that's biased, that is oppressive. Being neutral is oppressive, and being balanced is oppressive. Now, I do understand that, people may not have rightly applied objectivity. They may not have rightly applied neutrality. They might have not rightly applied balance. But to say that those principles are oppressive and get rid of them, you see, that's a big difference between cleaning up the objectivity to make it truly objective, cleaning up neutrality by making it truly neutral, and cleaning up balance and making it truly balanced. And so the principles of objectivity, neutrality, and balance need to stay. Whatever wrong application they were making of that in the past needs to be corrected, but those principles need to stay. Now, because objectivity is oppressive, part of the problem, they would say do away with it. Now, you think about some of these big universities going on, and of course this Doge thing that our new president brought in to see where all the money's going is kind of bringing some of this stuff out. But you take away objectivity, and that's what you have a lot in these universities. They're not objective at all. It's subjective morality. It's subjective ethics, these kind of things. You take away neutrality, if you can't be neutral, and neutral is you're not going to take sides. Now, you might believe a side or another side, but you can't teach someone your side of it. You have to teach it neutrally. And then, but see, if you do away with neutrality, then what are you going to have? You're going to be favoring one side or the other. Or, you're going to favor one side, basically. And then balance, if you take away balance, now balance is simply stating if you give one view, there's an opposition, like take the theory of evolution. Well, you can teach the theory, and that's all it is a theory. But to be balanced, you would teach creation along with it and allow the people to make up their own mind. But you can't do that because that's balance is oppressive. And so these things in academia, objectivity, neutrality, and balance, part of the status quo, part of the oppressing, you got to do away with it. Well, you think about what that did to the news media, and you wonder why the news media is so messed up over the last 20 years or so, because they can't be objective because that's part of the problem. So what are they? Very subjective. You can't be neutral because that's, in their mind, the oppressive status quo, neutrality. And so they're one-sided, talking about the mainstream media. You can't be balanced because, balance is oppressive. And so you got to only give one side of the story. And man, we see that all over the place today, do we not? Just one side of the story. And I know Fox News a long time ago had that, they came up with the slogan, fair and balanced. Well, fair and balanced, that balance is a catch term to a lot of people because of this critical race theory. And so they'd be talked about as if they were, I was going to say racist, but racist, or, they're bad because they're balanced. They even claim to be balanced. But these are things that, again, this deconstruction, reconstruction stuff comes along. Now, we talked about authenticity a few episodes back, and we mentioned this there, and here's, another situation here, that authenticity is, what they mean by authenticity is not what we mean by that, or what I mean by that. When I hear the term authenticity, I think genuine, real, but what they mean by that, as we discussed earlier, is that authenticity is you have to go against the status quo in order to be authentic. Or in their terms, critical race theorists would say you have to resist color blindness, you have to resist integrating into what they would call the white world in order to be authentic. And so if you're a dark-skinned colored person, but you still believe in object, neutral, and balanced, well, you're part of the problem. And that's why you can have people in prominent positions in our country that are dark skin color, but they don't buy into the critical race theory. Well, they'll just get kicked aside. They'll just get, they'll get torn down verbally and all that. And, Uncle Tom and all this kind of stuff, which, if anybody ever read the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, you'll know that Uncle Tom was a hero of the plot. He wasn't some traitor. He wasn't some, Judas or something like they make him out to be now. But there's another story behind that as well as to how that got changed around. But the real Uncle Tom was a Christ-like figure in the novels. But anyway, a quote here, a major theme of critical race theory reflects the colored intellectuals' persistent battle to avoid being rendered inauthentic by the pressures of adapting to the white world. And so authenticity is resisting integration. And we see that a lot here. Now, the basic premises here, what evidence do critical race theorists use to show that the status quo is oppressive, etc.? Well, number one, there's two main sources. Number one, they draw on their own experiences or the experience of others they know that support their thesis. And so there'll be a lot of storytelling about what happened to me back in the day, or what happened here, what happened there. And it's true. And I taught a class in a very prominent city in Florida. And I learned so much from that class because there were people older in that class that went through the civil rights movement. They could tell me of some of the experiences that they had that were just shameful, that what white people did to them was just shameful. And I know other brethren from other parts of the country, the same things were done. That's just, it's just hard to believe. And that, in fact, for a long time, I guess I had more confidence in my brethren maybe, but I didn't think that stuff happened. But it did. It did back in the day. And so there was a lot of bad things that happened. And so a lot of stories are told.
and then and perpetuated down through the ages. However, I will say that I was very encouraged when the some recent things happened with Mr. Floyd, who was killed. That there was a podcast that had three young men on. Well, actually, they had a young guy, a middle-aged guy, and an older guy, all from African descent. And the host asked them at the very end, have you ever been treated? Have you ever been treated wrongly by white brethren? And not a single one of them said they had. And again, that was from a guy probably in his early 30s, a guy in his 40s, and a guy in his 50s. And I thought that was pretty good, that none of them said they had. And of course, that was just three guys and their experience. But anyway, the main sources of critical race theorists use is that, the experiences of others that they know. They also point to unwanted racial disparities in America. And they'll throw out statistical differences between racial groups, such as infant mortality rates, life expectancy, incarceration rates, and income rates. And they always see those as being related to ethnicity or skin color. And so since critical race theorists are subjective and political, they do not objectively consider the possibility of other explanations. And of course, there is a gap, and a lot of that just has to do with, well, there's a number of factors. I'll just put it like that. All right. But that's kind of a basis of critical race theory. They do not think of racism, quote unquote, as most Americans usually do. And critical race theorists, they do have an interest in how racism relates to power structures. And so that's something that can be talked about later. But as we think about how we can better improve relations between ethnicities, and there's some other things that we could talk about critical race theory, but we're kind of running out of time for this episode. But again, just think of how we are made in the image and likeness of God. And of course, in my life, I don't know. I did live in Lakeland, Florida back in the late 60s as a 3 and 4-year-old. I did ask my dad one time, were there actually signs in Lakeland that said, white only? And he said, yeah, there sure were. And then I've heard of members of the church even back in the 50s and stuff who were members of the KKK. Couldn't believe it. But the sources that told me that, I have no reason to doubt the accuracy. And so this stuff has been, there is real racism. It has been in the past, and maybe there is today, although I think it's a lot less than what it used to be. But just think about it. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. Every single one of us is the image and likeness of God. We are God bearers. And so we must treat each other that way. Also keep in mind that the gospel is for all. And I think about Matthew's account of the gospel. He begins in, going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But yet it ends, make disciples of every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I've commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. And then we also need to think about Jesus' invitation, come all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. That anybody who is wearied and heavy laden, who is tired of sin, no matter his skin color, no matter his background, ethnicity, Jesus is the answer. And if we bring people to Jesus, bring ourselves to Jesus, we won't have the issues that critical race theorists have seen and perhaps in fact, I know they've overblown, but we'll see each other as Jesus sees us. And that's a goal that all of us can seek to attain. And so we're going to close this for now, and I know I wanted to get into more, and I'd love to have the discussion with my brothers Forrest and Stephen, but we'll kind of pick this up perhaps in another episode But as it stands now, we will close this season 2 out. We appreciate your listening to us, and we'd invite your feedback. Again, you can email me at Brian, BRIAN, at FSOP.net, and that'll come direct to me. But we appreciate your listening to us, and we look forward to season 3. But we will have a few episodes. We call them bumper-sodes in between the seasons, and we got some good lessons coming up on leadership. And so we appreciate your being here with us, and we love you, and we pray that you will have a good life in Christ and that you will live with him eternally. Please join us next time as we discuss these important things.
Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, pave the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory. Praise the Lord, blessed Lord. Salvation has been brought down from heaven. Go and shout, and shout, and tell it the world around. Go preach it and tell it today to people in sorrow. Tell it today.